friends, welcome. And thank you for coming. We are last minute changing the topic to cover Noah and the flood. My driveway was like a river when I left to come over here, just crazy. And people were texting me and calling me saying, can't come because of the weather. I was coming because of the weather. You came. Anyway, well done. So the Reverend Bill Roth and I tonight want to talk about Christian marriage. It's one of the things sometimes I think we kind of take for granted, but they don't actually wind up talking about, and it's interested me lately. You know, as everybody has a personal background on this thing, I got married here at this church back in 1986 on March the 1st. I looked, handsome and dashing at the time. I don't know what's happened since then. Lisa looks about the same. And when we got married, I mean, if you asked us, were we having a Christian marriage, I think we would, I'm a pastor, right? But I think even then I would have said, well, we're Christians and we're getting married and we're going to do our best. I guess that'll be a Christian marriage. I'm not sure we really did any better than that. And I think we can do better than that. And she and I have learned to try to do better than that over time. So I want to talk about that some. I've shared with some of you before, and I'm hesitant to say this because I have some newlyweds in the room that I did marry. So granted that I loved doing your wedding, I've said to groups before, I've gotten to where I don't really enjoy weddings anymore. When I first started in the ministry, I thought, doing weddings, this will be such holy, sacred work. This will be great. But over the years, it's changed so much, and now it's kind of this party and this spectacle, and as the clergy, you feel like you're just kind of stuck in there somewhere, like, we also need a minister. We're not sure why. Or people want to get married here. Perfect strangers call us. Your church looks pretty. Can we get married there? They're just looking for a pretty place to be the kickoff for the cocktail party. And you have all this that goes on, and I don't know. I guess it's kind of fun, but I find myself not enjoying it too much. As a guy that I know, a theologian named James K.A. Smith, Jamie, he wrote a book called You Are What You Love, and he has a fascinating chapter in there about marriage, and he says this: our interest in our culture is in the spectacle of the wedding, the event in which we get to be center stage, display our love, and invite others into our romance in a way they'll never forget. The wedding industry thrives on competition, novelty, and one-upmanship. If you attended weddings, you know that this actually is the case, right? He says the rituals of the wedding industry are liturgies of narcissism. You know Narcissus, the guy that is obsessed with his own reflection. And in Jamie's book, he pulls out this piece of art. Here you have a romantic couple, but of course they're both looking over the shoulder, checking their phones. That's truer than it ought to be and haunting. So as a pastor, I have a legal responsibility for marriage, and I find myself utterly uninterested in that nowadays. I mean, I sign these licenses, but I just kind of do it. That's just not of much interest to me. Something else that's gone on is that in our society, of course, marriage has become this politicized thing, and everybody argues about who should get to marry. In North Carolina, we had Amendment 1, and then we have people that were against Amendment 1, and a lot of tension. Should it be only for straights, or should it be also for gays who can get married? I find myself not interested in that political conversation very much. We actually have the same debate in the United Methodist Church and in all Christian churches that are at least willing to talk about it. Are you going to have same-gender marriage or not? And it's splitting the United Methodist Church apart. Right now we have a group meeting that was appointed by our Council of Bishops called the Commission on a Way Forward. And they're trying to figure out, what do we do? Do we form two churches? Do we agree to disagree? What are we going to do about this whole business of who can marry whom? Which I think complicates marriage for everybody in an odd way when that's going on, but I'm not sure in all the ways. So in church and society, we have debates about who should marry whom, and we have our ideology about it. And as I've said before, political ideology often becomes idolatry. I think the great idolatry of our age is political ideology. You know, talk to a conservative, what they believe is going to deliver the good life is their conservative political ideology. You get liberals, and they believe what will deliver the good life if we just have the fulfillment of our liberal political ideology. It becomes a god, and it's a false god that can't really deliver. Marriage is a big part of that. Jamie Smith in his book says, he talks about this. This is so interesting. People talk so much about family. Oh, family. He says the idolization of the family that breaks the modern family so easily. If you idolize the family. Families work well when we do not expect them to give us all we need. Baptism opens the home, liberating it from the burden of impossible self-sufficiency, while also opening it to the disruptive friendships that are the mark of the kingdom of God. He's already talking about a different kind of marriage, right? A marriage that opens itself to the world instead of kind of as this navel gazing of you will fulfill me, and so on. So the question is there such a thing as Christian marriage? And if so, what does it look like? Now, I just had on September the 23rd an interesting event in my life. My older daughter, Sarah, got married. And there I am, being the dad. I've never had that role before. I'm usually the guy in the robe. And it was tremendous fun as a wedding. What was fascinating about my daughter Sarah's wedding is that she and her fiancé Colin began, actually 2 or 3 years ago, to try to figure out how to construct a profoundly Christian relationship. Isn't that interesting? And then they wanted to have a profoundly Christian wedding ceremony to go with the profoundly Christian marriage. So one of the things that Sarah did ramping up to the wedding and then shortly after it is she did this blog called How to Be a Bride and Still Smash the Patriarchy. That's great, isn't it, right? And what she was talking about, the patriarchy, she's saying, is kind of the old thing that says, here's traditional marriage, what it looks like, and the man is there to receive the woman, and you have bridal showers, you have all the attention to the bride. What do you do with all that kind of traditional stuff that's very sexist, somewhat of her generation might say, right? And so in this blog, she wrote about all kinds of things, like why do we do the things that we do in weddings? She talked about things like, I mentioned this in a sermon a couple weeks ago. Some of her well-meaning friends kept asking her, are you keeping in shape so you'll look good in your wedding dress? And as she pointed out, nobody said to Colin, hey dude, are you staying fit so you look good in your wedding suit? It's like, what is that? And she said, I'm marrying a guy who loves me whatever I look like in my wedding dress. What is that about? Why do we have this kind of pressure? Her best line in all of her blogs, I thought, was this, because she got all this, when you say you're getting married, you begin to get advertising about people that want to help you and take your money to help you with your wedding. And something she got said, you could be a princess for a day. And her response to that was, I don't want to be a princess. I want to be a part of the kingdom. Sarah this year was also ordained. And when we do ordinations in the United Methodist Church, you're ordained with a bunch of other people. And somebody said to her, don't you wish you could have had your own ordination service? And Sarah said, well, no, I actually liked being ordained with a bunch of other people. And then she said, I would actually like it if I could be married with a bunch of other people. Like, could you have a big wedding day? And here are 12 couples in this year's class of Christian marrying couples, and we're going to be in this adventure together. We're going to support one another. Fascinating question. Now, if it sounds like a boring wedding, we did have a blast. I mean, don't misunderstand. This isn't a glum affair, trying to have a Christian marriage. Now, sometimes people talk about biblical marriage, and this always bothers me some, because all biblical marriages, you just don't want any part of it, right? Abraham passes his wife off as his sister. He marries several women. Jacob has a bunch of wives. They have a baby derby. Elkanah has a couple of wives. One is really snide to the other one. David, his wives are all political pawns, and then he takes the woman that he stole from another man and makes her the queen. Solomon has hundreds of wives. Biblical marriage would have been, for the poor people, utterly unromantic. If you lived in a little village that had 40 people in it and you were of marriageable age, there might be one other person of marriageable age, and that's who you'd kind of marry. And you didn't have date nights out or relationship counseling or any of that. You worked hard all day long till you fell asleep, exhausted at the end of the night. The next day you got up and did the same thing. That's just what biblical marriage was like. The Bible talks about things like in creation of Adam and Eve, God creates a helper fit for him. And so a man cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. Is the woman just a helper fit for the man? Ephesians 5 has this language, wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. That's kind of different, isn't it? Children, obey your parents. Slaves, obey your earthly masters. It's a fascinating text. How do we think about all of that? The wives submit to your husbands is something that Claude Alexander and I plan to talk about as we talk about domestic violence. in the months to come in our two churches. See, there you have for the people that say, well, marriage is between straight people, and if you get that straight, you're fine. But then actually, in a lot of straight marriages, there's violence, there's abuse, there's belittling, there's terrible stuff that goes on in the home. So it's more complicated than that. Genesis says to the first people, be fruitful and multiply. So is the purpose of marriage having children? So is procreation the purpose of marriage? That kind of sounds like a Christian idea. Roman Catholic theologians have often said that's the reason to marry. But then what do you do about infertility? What do you do about folks who adopt? What do you do when you have the aged who are marrying, including two in this room who are getting married next month? Procreation. The ideal in the Bible is actually interesting. Is the ideal in the Bible that you'll be married or that you'll be single? And if you just read the Bible, your ideal would be you should stay single. Marriage seems to be a big problem in the Bible. Jesus is single. Paul says, I wish all were as I am. To the unmarried, I say, remain single as I do. But if they cannot exercise self-control, this is a lovely view of marriage, right? If they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Interestingly, David Brooks, who I think always has something wise to contribute to public conversations, alluded to this sometime back as his case for why we should have same-gender marriage, is that if people are going to be sexually active, why not let them have the gift of permanence and stability versus being denied? It's really interesting. He raised that 10 years ago, early in the conversation. So I want to think a few more minutes here about what is holy matrimony, and is there even such a thing as a holy sexuality? Sexuality is so co-opted by any and everybody, by TV shows, movies, books, advertising, everything. And it's not a holy sexuality. And so we tend to think sexuality just is, and then becomes a source of frustration and sometimes betrayal. Is there such a thing as a holy sexuality that's pleasing to God? I had the good gift when I was at Duke to study with Father Roland Murphy, who was a Roman Catholic scholar. And he wrote a commentary on this book, The Song of Solomon, that if you read it, this is intense romantic poetry that's in the Bible, but there's nothing lascivious about it. There's nothing tawdry about it. If anything, it's more pursuit than possession. It's more desire than completion. It's really interesting. What does that mean? To have physical, romantic desire for another person. Does it all have to be about fulfillment? How do we think about the desire, the honoring of the other person? There's a book by a conservative theologian named Deborah Hirsch called Redeeming Sex. It's a really good book. And she points out in there that with sex and spirituality, what you discover are your deepest longings, intimacy, and being lost in wonder. They're very similar, right? Sex and spirituality, can those be similar? Psalm 127 says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. So the question we might think about sometimes is not do we want to get married, but is God calling us to be married? It's a pretty important question. Once in a while, I want to strangle Lisa, or more likely, she wants to strangle me. And she's not here tonight, so I can talk about her. It's great. And one of the things that always sets this in perspective is when we're having any kind of tense moment, I back up and I ask myself, am I called by God to be married to this person? And my answer to that is unfailingly been yes. So then, other bets are off, and then you work some things out. Is it a calling? Has God called you to be together, and what is God calling you as a couple to do in the world? And what I love is this. My daughter Sarah and her now husband Colin have taken that very, very seriously. And in their wedding service, you got a real sense of what they feel called to reach out to the least and the lost through their marriage. That's what their marriage is going to be about. Henry Nouwen, the great Catholic spiritual writer, I'm going to just read some things to you because I think they're helpful. He says, many relationships are like interlocking fingers. Two people cling to each other as two hands interlocked in fear. They connect, but they cannot survive individually. But as they interlock, they also realize that they cannot take away each other's loneliness. It's great, isn't it? no matter how much you cling to another person, at the end of the day, you can't take away another person's loneliness. And it is then that friction arises and tension increases. Often a breakup is the final result. But God calls man and woman to a different relationship. It is a relationship that looks like two hands that fold in an act of prayer. The fingertips touch, but the hands can create a space, like a little tent. Such a space is the space created by love, not fear. Marriage is creating a new open space where God's love can be revealed to the stranger, the child, the friend, the visitor. Imagine that, thinking of your relationship not as clinging to each other, but as creating a space to exercise hospitality for others. Ephesians chapter 5, which we quoted briefly earlier, it's important to look at it closely. It says, "Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ." I spoke of this in my sermon yesterday. What would it be like always to have humility and to outdo one another in showing honor, as I said in my sermon yesterday? This mystery, marriage, is a profound one. It refers to Christ and the church. So if we're going to talk about Christian marriage, what we do is we think about Christ's love for the church. What is Christ to the church? And then how might we in our marriage reflect that or embody that? In the United Methodist liturgy that Bill and I use when we marry people, we have these words: "You have so consecrated the covenant of Christian marriage that in it is represented the covenant between Christ and his church." So Christ makes this unfailing, deeply loving commitment to the church, and then the church has its task in the world to be the body of Christ to the world. How is our marriage like that? That's when you begin to realize you actually do need to get married with other people. You need some other people to get that done, right? Just the two of you alone probably aren't going to get that done. When we exchange the rings, this is really interesting. You know, they will always have a photographer trying to zoom in and get a shot of, the great platinum setting and how fabulous the ring is. What we say about the rings is interesting. These rings are the outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace, signifying to us the union between Christ and his church. I mean, what if Lisa and I, every day when we take our rings on and off, wash our hands, whatever, if we would look at those rings and say that this is a symbol of God's grace and our union, not just with each other, but to Christ. Eugene Rogers, a great theologian, I love this. He said, "The point of marriage is training in holiness." Right? Like, why get married? He says the reason is to help each other to be holy. And he compares it then to monasticism. So you have monks who live together in a community. He says it's the same thing as a marriage. That sounds like it could not be more different than a marriage. But you have monks who live together in a community, so as he puts it, they're stuck with people, and you learn their worst habits and their most annoying ways of doing things, but you're stuck together, and you got to figure out how to love each other and how to become holy together. He says marriage is the same thing. That's just brilliant to me. The whole business of making promises in marriage, Lewis Smead says, somewhere people make and keep promises. They choose not to quit when the going gets tough. They stick to lost causes. They hold on to a love grown cold. If you have a ship, you will not desert. If you have people, you will not forsake. If you have causes, you will not abandon. Then you are like God. Like, how can we in our marriage, in keeping our promises, think they're actually being like God in doing so? Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, to love another person is to help that person to love God. To be loved by another person is to be helped toward the love of God. Like, what if that's the mission statement of the marriage? Now, in all these things, one of the things that people inevitably struggle with is when people are at very different places spiritually and theologically. And that's a whole nother kind of challenge. When one person is very serious about this growth in the life of faith, and the other person could just care less. That's a daunting challenge. Indeed. Madeleine L'Engle, I love her. She's famous for writing children's books. She wrote a lot of good grown-up books, too, including this one called Two-Part Invention, which is the story of her marriage to Hugh Franklin, who, interesting, was a soap opera star. That's just fascinating to me. One of the things she says is this kind of is contrary to the American way of thinking about romance. A love which depends solely on romance, on the combustion of two attracting chemistries, tends to fizzle out. The famous lovers usually end up dead. A long-term marriage has to move beyond chemistry to compatibility, to friendship, to companionship. It is certainly not that the passion disappears, but that it is conjoined with other ways of love. I mean, that's one of the challenges of Christian marriage, although I think we have the means to cope with it, is what happens when the chemistry doesn't sizzle. Stanley Hauerwas, great theologian at Duke, wrote an essay about marriage where he began it by saying, you always marry the wrong person. I think this is absolutely, don't nod if you're sitting next to your spouse at the moment. His wisdom in that is you tend to think, I'll marry the right person, then everything will just be wonderful. But then things, unless you're just super lucky somehow, like it's a challenge. When you look at this person like, you married the wrong person in some way. What do you do when you've married the wrong person? This is a great hymn in the hymnal, and I can't see the words well enough, so we'll skip over that. At our wedding, we had this passage read, and we don't remind one another of it enough. And I've used it at many weddings. So I always think at weddings, people are dressing up and they're wearing special clothing, so it's a good image, right? Paul says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. So what do you put on? You put on compassion, kindness, lowliness, meekness, patience, forbearing one another, forgiving each other, and above all these, put on love. And again, in the United Methodist liturgy, at weddings, we say this at the end of the service, bear witness to the love of God in this world. I always want to stop the couple and shake them at this point and say, listen to this, do this, so that those to whom love is a stranger will find in you generous friends. Like for so many people, love really is a stranger to them. Like they look okay, and if you ask them how they're doing, they'll say fine. But they need generous friends who can help them see that love isn't such a stranger. Just a few more things and I'll be done. I'm doing a class next week on Martin Luther, with the 500th anniversary of him sparking the Protestant Reformation. One of the things that meant is that Luther got married, right? He was a monk, and the woman that he married had been a nun, but then after the Reformation happened, you didn't have monks and nuns anymore, and nobody knew what to do. So people started marrying each other, and Luther married this nun that he knew named Katerina. And what's fascinating to me is he sent out wedding invitations, personalized, to his friends. Here are two of them. So his friend Spalatin, he said, you must come to my wedding. I have made the angels laugh and the devils weep. And to his friend Leonard Kopp, he wrote, I am getting married. God likes to work miracles and make a fool of the world. I quote that. I think it's funny. But also, is there something in Christian marriage that is intent on making a fool of the world? Like most marriages mimic the world. Like the world says, here's what you do for your wedding, and you go do that. And the world says, here's what marriage is, and here's the kind of help you need to get through a marriage, and you try to do it, and whatever. You go on, fabulous, make it, whatever it is that you think is that. There's something in Christian marriage that it's different. It's an alternative, and it might actually look foolish to the world, but might be making a fool of the world. N.T. Wright, a great bishop in Great Britain, at someone's wedding. So this guy, he's like the most famous English theologian in the world right now, who's officiating at somebody's wedding. And he wrote these words for their wedding, which I've used at many weddings. One of the reasons why marriage is so important, and actually one of the reasons why marriage is so difficult, is that it puts up a signpost against all the odds, speaking of love and glory in a world of suspicion and shabbiness. Marriage is hilarious, laugh with it. Marriage is solemn and serious, stand in awe of it. Marriage is hard work, get on with it. Marriage is a celebration, drink to it. Marriage is a gift, thank God for it. Marriage is a signpost. This intrigues me. Raise that signpost and maintain it for the rest of us and for the rest of the world. I mean, all the stuff that I've been reading lately about marriage has this thing that your marriage makes some kind of statement to other people. And it can make a statement about God, about faith, about goodness, about the mission of the church. A great book I would recommend by Walter Wangerin, Lutheran pastor, called As for Me and My House. Just a very wise book. I'm going to skip these last things. One of the things that we're talking about marriage tonight, and we hope that you and others will come back on Saturday, November the 4th at 5 o'clock. We hope you'll take some of this stuff and think about it and talk about it among yourselves. Then on November the 4th at 5 in our sanctuary, we're going to have a reaffirmation of the marriage covenant. I actually did this in May with some folks. We were in Israel, and we went to Cana, where Jesus, turned the water into wine at the wedding at Cana. We did marriage renewal there, and it was really moving for folks to be able to do that. We make you look each other in the eye and repeat the vows that you said once upon a time. What does it mean to recommit? Maybe to commit to a new kind of marriage, a deeper kind of marriage, or a more robustly Christian kind of marriage. So we hope that you'll come back for that. Let me turn it over now to Bill Roth.
We'll get to this, trust me. It's part of the program. I'm going to go through a couple bullet points, and before I do, I got a quick story. There was a young pastor one time who was preaching in his first church, and he was preaching all the time on parenting, and it seems like about once a month he'd have some kind of sermon about how to parent children, and then one of his parishioners a couple years later noticed there was no more sermons on parenting, and kind of came to him one day in the office and says, I used to hear a lot from you about how to raise kids and how to parent. I really enjoyed that, but I haven't heard anything in the last couple of years. What happened to you? What's going on? He said, oh, well, I've had children now. So it was a little bit like that for me with marriage. I don't talk a lot about marriage anymore, and the reason is because I got married. It's because now I actually have to do it, and James says it's harder than it looks, right? So sometimes as a pastor, we talk and tell sermons and stuff like that. It's hard to live some of this stuff out. But I got a few bullet points I want to run through here. First thing I want to suggest to you is that Christian marriage, for me, is something that's not special. And what I mean by that, listen here. What I mean is it's what we're all called to do. We're all called to love one another. And in Christian marriage, it's a microcosm of what God has called me to do in the world, is it not? I mean, am I to love my wife any more than anyone else, or are we to love all people? And so for me, what I'm doing when I get married is I'm embodying the love of Christ in the flesh, in this body, to my wife. But I don't think I'm called any less to do that, to embody the love of Christ to the person I meet on the street, to the stranger, to my friends. So in some ways, there's something that's really special about marriage, let's name that, but there's something about marriage that's not so special. It's the ordinary stuff of what we Christians are called to do, to embody the love, the presence of God in the world to another person. We're just committing to do it in a very special way to this person. So there's something about marriage that's very extraordinary, and there's something about marriage to me that's very, very ordinary. It's the kind of thing that I'm called to do all the time, at all places. It's something that I'm supposed to be about. So the second part I would want to point out is it is a calling, and James mentioned that. And I like the words. I think Adam Hamilton's got a book about marriage, and he has some great stories in there about his own when he realized he was finally married. But one of the things about marriage is it is really a calling to be present to another person in a very special way, in a Christ-like way, to be the love of God in the flesh, as I said. So in one way, it's very special. In another way, it's just the ordinary thing, but it is our calling as Christians to love others after the example of Christ's love for us. The other point I want to make is about what I see, and I'm going to speak about marriage as a counselor now. I wear two hats. I'm a licensed marriage and family counselor. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I'm also an ordained ministry. So I kind of flow back and forth between those two hats. I want to talk to you kind of over here as a counselor for just a minute and tell you a little bit about what I see a lot of times in my office and what I've seen across my career as a counselor. What I see a lot of times is relationally in marriages that people get stuck in a cycle in their marriages. And the cycle is a lot like, if you would think about it like this, if you go into your house and you had a window air conditioner and you had the furnace and you turned them both on at the same time, you'd be in a world of trouble, wouldn't you? You'd have the air conditioning running and you'd have the heat running, and the more the heat ran, the more the air conditioner keeps running, and the more the air conditioner keeps running, the more the heat's going to run, and it kind of gets in a loop going back and forth. And both of them burn themselves out. And this is often what happens in marriage. You get a cycle going, and the cycle begins to kind of eat up the marriage. And what happens is this, that you find out that one person is wanting to get close in their marriage and to be a little bit more connected to the person. And they're frustrated about some of the distance in the marriage, and so what happens, they're kind of like the thermostat, they're turning up the heat. But they're not turning up the heat in the most appropriate way. Maybe they're frustrated about the distance, and so the conversation when the person comes home from work one night isn't like, you know, I really love you, I miss you, I wish you didn't work so much, I really wish we could spend more time together. It sounds a little bit like, where have you been? Are you working late again? How come you're always working late? You seem like you're always coming home late. How come you're never home? Do you hear how different that sounds than I love you and I really miss you? Which might be the intent, but it sounds really differently because the person hasn't really shared what they're really feeling deep down. So what happens in a lot of marriages that I see, one person's wanting a deeper connection, they're frustrated, and they express the frustration in a way that's kind of coming in kind of hot, coming in a little bit too tough, too hard to hear, too hard to handle. The other person hears conflict. They hear the frustration. They hear the anger in their voice. And so then they cycle on, and they use not connection to protect the relationship. They use distance. This person sounds a little angry about me working so many hours. I think I'll just kind of take a step back. Which is interesting because the very thing that this person over here wants by expressing their frustration is they want me to come closer. But the way they express it sounds hot, so I step back, giving them the opposite of what they want. They actually, by being a little hot, cause me to pull back and cool things down. And then when I try and cool things down, guess what they do? They get a little hotter. And guess what? When they get a little hotter, I take another step further back. And what happens is this cycle is what eats up marriages over and over and over again. And the problem is the couple are not sharing what's going on at the deeper level. And one of the things I'd say to you about a Christian marriage is if you're going to have a Christian marriage, then you better have a lot of strength and a lot of courage because you're going to have to make yourself vulnerable. You can't live on the surface and have a Christian marriage. You're going to have to be willing to share what's really going on. And you're going to have to share it in a way that can be heard. So if you want some connection, if you're the one who wants a little more connection, you're the heat in the relationship. You can't come in hot, overwhelming, and flooding somebody and say, where you been? It's going to have to sound a little bit more like, you know, when you're gone a lot, I really miss our times together, and I'd like to have more of those because you're so important to me. How could we do that? That pulls somebody in. What we don't know in our marriages is over and over again, you got two people who are doing the best they can. And because they're doing the best they can, they think the other person must be the problem. And so they get locked in a cycle of blame. And what they don't understand is kind of like a figure eight and figure loop. They're just kind of going back and forth. And there's no end in it. There's no point where you can say, well, this is where it started, and this is the person who's at fault. It's just a deadly kind of loop back and forth, and they're stuck in that cycle. And that's what Bronna Livingston, who's a counselor here at the church, and myself, over and over again, we see in marriages, people who've gotten stuck in a loop. And that's one of the issues. I want to give you a story, and that's what the porcupine, so we're getting full circle here. So there's a story in the Native American folklore about the porcupine. It seems one winter there was a winter that was colder than any other, and it was bitter, bitter cold. a lot of the porcupines were dying. They were freezing to death. And so one of the leaders of the porcupines called them all together and said, we're going to freeze. There'll be no porcupines. We got to do something. So they decided what they're going to do is they're going to gather themselves together and get close together. And in doing that, there'll be heat, and they'll be warm, and they'll be able to survive. So that's what they do. The porcupines all kind of gathered together, and there was the body heat, and they were able to be warm, and they were able to stay alive. But one of the problems was you ever get close to a porcupine? Anybody here ever petted a porcupine? Wouldn't recommend it. As they got close to each other, the quills began to poke each other. And they're having all these kind of little lacerations, all these little cuts and punctures and all kinds of things like that. And so they decided they didn't want to do that anymore. So they decided, we'll move apart. And the porcupines began to freeze, and they began to die again. So the porcupines had to make a decision. Were they going to learn how to live with all the little pokes and the little punctures and all the little places where we prod each other and stab each other and jab each other in ways we don't want to be stabbed and jabbed? We're going to either figure out how to live with that, or we're going to die. Now, that's a pretty beautiful metaphor for kind of our world. We're going to have to all figure out how to live together with all the quills and the pokes and all the little jabs that go on about being human together in this world, or we're going to die. But it's also, on a smaller microcosm, it's a story of our marriages. We have to figure out how to get beyond the conflicts that happen when people get close together. Because when people get close together, you think, boy, it's going to be wonderful. We're going to be married. It's romantic. It's fabulous. And anybody that's been married for more than a year knows that this is not true, right? It takes some hard work after a while. Because there's going to be a lot of quills that each person's going to have, and they're going to poke each other and jab each other. And they got to figure out how to get past that, or it's going to be a really cold, cold marriage, right? So one of the things I would suggest to you as a way of thinking about that, one of the best things you can do for your marriage is a U-turn. Now, we all know what a U-turn is. It's when you're driving down the road and you realize you forgot something at home and you got to just turn around and go back the other way. You don't keep on going if you forgot something. The problem is in our marriage, when we're in a state of conflict or we get in that cycle or that loop, we never think about doing a U-turn. Let me tell you what a U-turn looks like. In a marriage relationship, a U-turn would look like this. I'm in a conflict with my wife, my spouse, my other person, and so we're not getting along, and we're starting to escalate a little bit, and if I don't do a U-turn, I just dig in, and it's blaming back and forth, just taking turns. You're it. No, you're it. No, you're the problem. No, you're the problem. Back and forth. A U-turn is a little different. It's a tool where you are suddenly above the fight and suddenly thinking, what's going on inside of me? I wonder why I'm reacting so much to what Linda just did. That's my wife's name. Why am I reacting that way? And suddenly it's not all about what she did, and suddenly I'm thinking about what's going on inside of me. And I'm thinking like, I wonder what the opportunity for growth is here. Because what I'm aware of is that whenever I have a strong reaction inside of myself, it's a signpost, to use a word James used earlier, it's a signpost of work that I still need to do. If I'm having a strong reaction, it's not about the other person, it's about, I wonder what's happening in me that's getting stirred. And it's a chance for me to do some more work. And so marriage is this wonderful opportunity, a Christian marriage is this wonderful opportunity for some more wholeness, where we come to know kind of what's going on inside ourselves, if we're willing to do a U-turn. But what do most of us do? When we get frustrated, we continue to dig in, and it becomes a tug-of-war about who's going to wear the mantle of it's your fault, who's going to take the blame. But in a marriage, if you win a fight, you lose, right? It's kind of like being in a crowded room and your enemy's right here and you want to get your enemy, so you pull the grenade pin and just lob it over there. Guess what? You got your enemy, but you lose, right? And that's what fighting in a marriage is. It's losing the war while you might win that one battle, okay? So let me just real quickly, and then we got time for questions and answers for both of us, very quickly talk about a model that I read about the other day. And it didn't necessarily apply to marriage, but it applies very much as I understand this model of a U-turn. And it's comes from the word flowing. You think about, the Buddhists talk about being in the flow. You can use that image if you want. But a U-turn looks like this. So you're in a marriage and you're having a fight with your spouse, and rather than going on with the fight, you kind of call your own time out, take a step back, take a walk, do whatever, and say, what am I feeling as I consider this interaction? What's going on inside my body? My heart's racing, it's pounding. What's happening inside of me? And you start thinking about what's getting triggered. And then you start to listen to that. Well, what's that? I'm really angry that, that Linda did whatever she did. Let me just make something up. I'm really angry that Linda forgot to lock the door last night. Like, okay, so I listened deeply to that. So I wonder why I'm so angry about that. It's just, we're all okay. It's over. She forgot to, I've done it before. Why am I so reactive to that? And I begin to listen deeply. So I pay attention to my feelings, and I listen to them very deeply with curiosity, not with a judgment. And that's a key point here. A lot of times we'll look at our feelings and we'll judge them. And then I'm open and hearted and compassionate to what I'm hearing. So as I identify my feelings, I'm really angry because she left the door unlocked. And then I begin to listen to that and think about, gosh, I wonder what that part of me that's so angry wants me to know. Suddenly it's not about her. Suddenly it's about my own growth and my own learning. And my marriage now becomes a chance for me to grow and become more whole. And so I have an openness to that. Rather than saying, what's wrong with me? I got so angry at Linda. That was really bad. That's stupid. Suddenly it's like, I wonder what that's about. Why did I react that way? And probably what I'll learn is maybe there was some issue about having had a break-in another time, or somebody left the door open or something, that something got triggered inside of me. And so I'm reacting not just to Linda, but I'm reacting to my history, which leads to the W in flow, which is bearing witness to your history. So when you're in that moment and you're open to what's going on, you also want to know, I remember when I was in seminary, I was down in Anderson Street Apartments, and I was broken into. Horrible feeling to come home. Actually came in the front door where the guy was going out the side window. And it was a really scary feeling. You call 911, you kind of hunker down. Do I leave? Do I run? What do I do? So you start thinking about your history, and you realize, oh gosh, I'm reacting with more here than I need to. And you take that kind of step back. So suddenly, you're not fighting with somebody else about them leaving the door unlocked. What you're really doing is you're bearing witness to, an old wound. And then you can kind of integrate that into your marriage. Like, hey, when you left the door open the other night and I got really upset, I want to apologize because I realized I was reacting from some real history that I had quite a while back, and one time we were broken into when I was in seminary, and that was really scary, and I'm reacting with $50 worth of anger here to something I should have had about $1 worth of anger about. And then I can begin to integrate my history. And so suddenly we're getting intimacy and connection, and I'm getting integrated in myself, and we're not fighting anymore. Because why? I'm no longer blaming her. I did a U-turn to come back and say, what's going on inside of me? I get real tickled, I hear people in this day and age, and it's really sad because we don't see much of this. What we see is, you name anybody. Could have been Obama a few years ago. It could be Trump today. And you put them on the screen and there's somebody throwing something at the TV, they're yelling and screaming. All these reactions. And it's not the person on the screen. It's like, what got triggered in you? What is it that's going on inside you? What are you feeling? Anger, frustration, what is it? Listen some curiosity. What's that about? What are you frustrated and angry? What are you scared about? What's happening? Can you be open to that and not judge it and let it tell you what it needs to know? Can you figure out where that comes from in your history? Can you then begin to integrate it into your life story? And then can you be nurturing about whatever that wound is? And then finally, can you also be nurturing towards others? So flowing is this wonderful model about not being reactive to what's going on out here, be it a political situation, but more important for us tonight, be it our marriages, and start going inward and doing the inner work, which is the soul work of growing. And marriage becomes, to me, this wonderful incubator where we come together and we get in a relationship and we lock the door, we say we're not getting out, it becomes that crucible. And this is where we can begin to do some deep personal work together with another person. We grow and we heal in our marriages in that way. Do you have any comments or questions for either James? And I'm going to stop at this point and just kind of bring James back up here and say, what would you want to ask? You can play Stump the Pastor, Stump the Counselor, or whatever like that. And what would you like to ask or question us about? You can also say, I got this friend, if you want to use that approach. It's very, very common to use that in these settings.
I meant to mention something earlier when I was up here is a lot of times I hear this, I'm sure Bill does too, people who, they get married and they assume that if I go to church and maybe even if we pray, that like everything will be great. You hear this thing, the couple that prays together stays together or whatever. I knew this couple years ago. They were mean as hornets to each other and to everybody else. But one was in the hospital one day, and the husband tearfully told me, we've never gone to bed at night without kneeling by the bed and praying. And I thought, it's not doing you any good. So it's just to paste church attendance and prayer on top of something doesn't really do any good. If anything, it can kind of mask what's really going on, right? Because you think, oh, we got God, so therefore we don't have to deal with other things. But there's other stuff to deal with, other disciplines to develop. And it may just be simple things like, making a practice of encouragement. Nobody ever comes to my office and says, the problem I have with my spouse is that they encourage me too much. You ever had that complaint? That doesn't happen. And just learning, and people think communication is the key to a marriage. Well, sometimes people communicate wonderfully and the marriage falls apart because they're saying, you're ugly, you're mean, I don't like you. I mean, they're communicating, but it's not good stuff. It's not constructive. And just things like learning how to resolve conflict. I mean, a lot of couples really struggle with this. The kind of thing Bill's talking, at least I did this so poorly early in our marriage. We had this marriage workshop at our church, and I thought, well, we should go because everybody else, we're trying to get other people to go, so we went. I didn't really want to go. And in it, they had an activity where you sat in a circle and you had to go around and you had to answer this question, when there's a conflict, my spouse becomes this animal. So it came to me first, I thought, I'm going to nail her. This is easy. So I said, an ostrich. Because she's from one of these no conflict families, nothing's wrong, head in the sand. I thought that was brilliant. It goes around a few more people, then it comes to her and she says, vulture. Pick it to death. So how does an ostrich stay married to a vulture, right? I got to deal with something now and she wants to deal with it like never. How do you negotiate these things? Simple little things like that. The other thing that I meant to mention is, and I'm just speaking candidly, in the debates about same-gender marriage, for me, one of the things that alters that conversation is that a lot of people are against same-gender marriage, but they don't seem to mind the kind of marriage that I showed you in the first couple of slides. That's just kind of wild party stuff. People don't really have anything to do with the church. They're not trying to do anything in the eyes of God. They're not responding to God's call or anything else, but that seems fine. But then we can't have same-gender marriage. And then sometimes we run into people, they're of the same gender, and they're really trying to consecrate their lives to God and to make a holy commitment. It's interesting to see those two beside each other. It's part of what we try to contemplate when we think, what do we do as a church about all this? Anyway, what did y'all want to ask us? I interrupted, giving you time to think about what you wanted to ask us about.
I want to piggyback on what you just said about same-gender relationships. And for me, it's about the quality of the relationship. To me, the biblical principle of marriage is one where we are, as I said earlier, we are trying to become in the flesh Christ or God to another person. What a calling, what a huge calling. It's not about my gender. It's about the quality of the relationship that I have with God so that I can embody that same loving relationship to another person. And that, as I said earlier, in some ways, marriage is not special because I'm supposed to be doing that all the time. I'm just now committing to do it in a special way with this person. But this is nothing unique to us to love another person in spite of all their little quills. You know, that's really what it means to be in the world, to be able to get along. And I think what really makes me sad is I think about young people growing up today, and they're watching what's going on in the political discourse, and just seeing what's not going on, what's not going well. And there's this sense of, to be married, that you have to find somebody who's like your soulmate, who's like you. And I think what's going on in politics reinforces, because what we see is, I can't be friends with somebody if they're Democrat or if they're liberal and I'm conservative. We can't be friends. It's almost like you don't see any of that going on. So what we're reinforcing in people is, we have to find people who are like us so that we can be together. Otherwise, if we're not like us, we have to expel them or get away from them. And the idea is silly, because the deeper you go in a relationship, the more you realize the differences, and that we're all really different people. That all marriages are cross-cultural if you want to get serious about it. And so what happens is people are running around thinking, I got to find my soulmate. I got to find this person who's just like me and thinks like me and acts like me, and all this kind of stuff is like, that's not possible. It's not necessary, because what you really need to have is not a sense of finding somebody who's like you, but finding a person that you are willing to love and be committed to, who's different from you, because all people are different. All marriages are cross-cultural.
You always marry the wrong person.
And that note, can you speak to interfaith marriages, and how to support those, and just thoughts on the Methodist Church?
I've seen interfaith marriages go really well and same-faith marriages go really badly, right? And some of it has to do with these same kinds of principles. You know, the Walter Wangerin book, he talks about, you know, what's the key to, what are the keys to a successful working marriage? And he's real big on values, and I think there's something to that. And values are things like, what is money for? You know, is it for spending today, or is it for saving for retirement? You got to, you know, so if your values are close, you do okay. So you can have very close, workable values with someone actually of another faith. Now, someone of no faith, that gets to be more complicating, but still sometimes those actually survive and do well, because again, they decide to love another person. Jesus didn't come along and say, are you Jewish or not? Check, okay, I'll love you. Jesus just kind of loved people. It's kind of interesting. So on Bill's model of, we're just supposed to love people. Now, I think I'm grateful that my daughter is marrying a Christian guy, because that kind of settles a few things for them, like what do we do on Sunday morning? What, you know, Josh and Nisi got married. They both sing in our choir. It's easy for y'all. It's good. What do you do with children? That gets to be sometimes a dizzying complication in the interfaith marriage. Do we go to synagogue? Do we go to church? The child, you think they'll get the best of all worlds, but they usually wind up kind of torn and confused. So, huge challenge.
And I think I don't see the challenge of how the challenge is real. And I think the thing, though, that breaks the couple up is usually one of them sooner or later wants the other one to be like them. Right. You know, it's like, you got to convert. You got to come to my way. My ways, you know, and you know, we can't be an interfaith couple and be married because, you know, there's a big difference. It's like, so we're all different. There's going to be a big difference. Let's kind of get over that and move forward with the act of beginning to really learn to love each other. There's a lot of pressure on this soulmate. That's probably one of the worst terms that's set marriage back forever, because we all think we're going to find our soulmate, but we choose the wrong person, right? We get the wrong person, and that's okay, because the goal then becomes, how do I become the right person for that person? How do I grow up? How do I mature?
It reminds me of this other thing. This is just my weirdness, but sometimes I'm talking to younger couples, and they'll say, I married my best friend. And I never say it in response, but my gut is like, I did not marry my best friend. I need my best friend. His name is Tom. You know, I married my wife, and that's not to diminish her in the least. We're wonderful friends, but I have a best friend. That's like a different category that I also need in my life, right? So the one person can't fulfill everything that you need. So I think even using that kind of terminology can put too much pressure on that one person. Like, you got to be my wife and my best friend. Ugh. Anyway, that's just me. What else? So, let me get, by the way, on the interfaith marriage, sometimes we see things like a Roman Catholic marries a Methodist, and sometimes you've got to kind of pick which one you're going to be, and that can go well or poorly depending on the dynamics of how the decision is made. Sometimes it's made in a healthy way and everybody embraces what it is. Sometimes it's made in a power play way and somebody spends the rest of their life resenting it. So just because you made a decision doesn't mean that it was a healthy kind of decision. Anyway, Tom.
In that same vein, going back to a comment you made earlier about couples that are coming together where they're in different places in their faith walk or their journey. And I do have a friend, 35 years here, so this is a friend that had a disastrous first marriage and has been through several years of bouncing around the physical relationships. And he is and through my eyes, he's a good man. He wants to do right. He is a believer, but his relationships are generally with those that are on the other end of the spectrum. And I know that's a hard question to answer, but do you have any general advice when you do have those couples that are coming from two different ends of the rainbow there?
My first reaction is they may not be on the other end of the spectrum or different parts of the rainbow. I tend to diminish that idea by thinking that we're all created in the image of God, and the story of our creation is one where God created us and called us good. So we're all kind of on the same foundation. My question would be kind of, if he's not in a relationship, kind of why is he kind of pulling back, and what's the wound there, and what's he scared of, and taking some time and doing some work, some individual work to kind of figure that out so he can have a healthy relationship. But I'm kind of stepping back a little bit about making a judgment about, you know, kind of who's good, who's bad, and why they're dating. You know, we're all with the wrong people, right? Back to that statement again. So we attract who we want to attract at that time, who we need in our lives for our own growth. I would recommend him doing some personal work around that.
And I mean, sometimes I don't think how to put this. I wish people come for counsel, for marriage, let me talk. People come for premarital counseling after the invitations have been mailed out, which is fine, except it's just the worst time to do that. I mean, well, once in a while, I mean, a marriage will break up at that point. Like, it's so bad, like you really shouldn't go through and get married. What I wish people would do is come for counseling before they make the decision to get married. Like, I'm thinking I might be called to marry this person. Let's talk about that. Let's see what's in it. Because a lot of people are habitually attracted to people that are going to be bad for them. Early in my romantic life, I was habitually attracted to just the very wrong people. I didn't marry one of them. And there are all kinds of reasons in that. You know, maybe you have a history of alcoholism in your family, so you're drawn to the next alcoholic who's going to ruin your life also with it, see. So how do you sort through all of that? How do you think through, you know, my daughter Sarah had a pretty extensive checklist, right? Like, she's not going to marry somebody who doesn't care for the poor and do something about it. She's not going to marry somebody who's anti-gay. She's not going to marry. She had a pretty long list because she knew what her values were, and she wanted to live with somebody who had those values. Most people don't think those things through. It's more of a kind of romantic crush, which is a cool thing, right? But as Madeline Lingle says, you know, the chemistry fizzles after a while. So then, you know, do you have the values? Do you have the structure of a relationship that you can build on? It's buildable with anybody, but sometimes you really marry the wrong person. I don't know. What else?
12 people getting married at once that you were speaking of? Like 12 people getting married? Remember when you said that?
Yeah.
Okay. Could we maybe do something where, like we got 12 couples together and just talked amongst each other about what's going on, and from range, age range from whatever to whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so Bill will speak to this better, but the idea of getting couples together to share is a great idea. What I find in at least my social world is we're absolutely no good at that. What I see happening is like guys get together and kind of gripe about the women in their world. And I always ask Lisa, do you and your friends do that? She says, oh no, surely they do. At any rate, we're not good at being vulnerable and being willing to say, here's something I'm really lousy at. Here's a real breakdown that I like to tell that to other people. But that's symptomatic of a larger thing, that within the life of the church, we ought to be able to do that. We know we're all broken people here, so we can come and say we're fine, but we're not being that holy when we do that. Can we come together and say we're broken, vulnerable people? Here's something we really struggle with. And you believe and trust the other couple won't go, oh. But they'll say, oh man, that's not our issue, but we got this other thing. And you could actually help and encourage each other, which would be a great thing. But that's hard to come by. Do you do some of that in the premarital workshop that we do? Does that?
Yeah, in the premarital workshop here at the church, we're teaching a lot of John Gottman, who happens to be not a therapist, but he's a Jewish research person. And we don't do group work. We do more the couples. When they come together for the workshop, we're going to learn a little bit of theory. I'll teach them a little bit about Sue Johnson, a little bit about some of the cycle, because I think if a couple doesn't understand a cycle, it really, really grips them when they get in that place where they get in those back and forth cycles where you're starting to kind of like heat up and cool down at the same time. So we teach them a lot about that. But we don't do anything like a couple sharing. We've done a few Marriage Matters 2 workshops, and we did one with a Sunday school class a little while back. But no, not a whole lot of that going on. But I'd love to talk to you some more about what you have in mind.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you have any suggestions on how to support friends who may be struggling in their marriage, that you love and you care about both of them and don't want to see that break up?
One of the first things is of course you want to be like Switzerland. You want to be neutral, and sometimes that's hard to do because sometimes you'll hear more of one side than the other. So if you're going to be a friend, you want to be a friend to the marriage, not just one of the persons, but the relationship. So, letting them know that, first of all, that you support them in their marriage and that you're there for the marriage first, and then for each of them second. That's key, because you can inadvertently, if you're not careful, you can be there more for one person, hear their side, and suddenly you're not Switzerland, you're kind of on their side, and you're kind of, it's a dangerous place. I'll never forget, in seminary, I saw a couple that were dating and quite heavily involved with each other break up, and then one of their good friends leaned over and said, I'm really glad you broke up with Sarah. She wasn't right for you, da-da-da-da-da. And 2 weeks later, of course, they got back together, and then that was the end of the friendship. Perfect. Right, yeah, that was the end of the friendship. So you don't want to, I saw that firsthand. You don't want to take sides. The other thing is, we have come so far in counseling in the last 10 years. We didn't have any idea what marriage was. We thought it was kind of like, well, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's some kind of, almost like an economic exchange theory. But marriage is a deep attachment to another person, not unlike when we are attached to our parents. We grow up with parents, hopefully are good. We attach to them. We leave home, go to college, go to job, do whatever we do in the world. But we're looking again to reattach because that's how we're wired. And so what we now know is marriage is a deep attachment relationship. And if we're not doing well in our marriage, it's because of that attachment not doing well. And so what we need to do is figure out, how can I stay connected to this person I'm married to and still be myself? Because that's the one question, and that's the one fight we're all having. We're all fighting about one thing in our marriage, and that is, do you love me? We'll fight We'll fight about, on the surface, about the laundry soap, about sex, about money, about our jobs. We'll fight about everything in the world, but really there's only one fight we're having underneath all that, and that's that fight to be deeply connected to another person and know that we're loved. And we're all trying to figure out, how can I be who I am and still be loved? And I think the Bible gives us a great foundation for that, which is while we're yet sinners, Christ loves us. While I'm still not perfect, I'm broken, I still can find love. First with God and then with another person. I have my own quills, she has hers, but we can find love. So I would number one, be there for the relationship. Number two, pray for them. Number three, look for a good counselor who can offer them some kind of counseling that would be along the lines of emotionally focused, which would look beyond the surface. They're fighting about soap and laundry and who watches too much football, and what they're really not getting at, because they keep talking about football and kind of saying, well, let's watch less football. And the real issue is, I don't feel loved, I don't feel connected, I don't feel safe. And that's where they have to go. You have to be vulnerable and go deep. And certain therapists would try and do it behaviorally. The good therapists will go deep.
And this idea of the witness of a Christian marriage, if you look at the Bible carefully, to me, witnessing isn't beating somebody over the head with the truth, right? Witnesses, if anything, it begins in listening, and then it continues in, I think, being humbly able to tell your own story of brokenness and where you found hope and healing, right? So to say, I've done this any number of times with any number of couples, and I mean on the friend level, not just on the pastor level, where I've told the Ostrich and Vulture thing. Everybody laughs, but then they see something in that. And I can say, that actually really helped us, because we talked a lot about how do you get a vulture to stay married to an ostrich and how do they talk to each other. And you can see somebody like, and I'm not saying you need to go do this, right? But you're just kind of telling, that was helpful to us. Talking about this U-turn thing, to help people name what's really going on is so key. I mean, so often it's not, the presenting problem is not the problem. Whenever people come to my office and they say, here's what's wrong, that's never what's wrong. Right. It's always something far deeper and very different, and they're even blind to it themselves. And it's become a sides thing. Another one, to me, for us, a helpful thing that the Wangren guy talks about is that sometimes you get this kind of the old back scratch idea. And couples start, I used to do this with Lisa, I would think. Like when I got married, I thought, I'm going to be the greatest husband in history. That was like my ambition. Great. And so at some point I remember thinking, I'm giving about, 68, 70%. She's only putting in about 30, but I'm noble. I can carry this. It's stupid. I was like the biggest fool in history. But you get kind of the sides. You kind of think who's giving what percentage, and this is a dead end, of course. And what Wangren says is it's helpful sometimes to imagine a third entity in the room with you. And that third entity is the relationship. And if that thing's healthy, everybody thrives. If that thing's unhealthy, it doesn't matter who's giving what to whom. So what he says is you think, I am all about the care and feeding of the relationship, and I'll do anything for the relationship. And if you both have that posture, you actually do fine, because if that thing's healthy, you do really well. So it's a way better way of thinking about it than the sides thing. It's been helpful for us.
That reminds me of Carl Whitaker. He was a psychotherapist. He had this wonderful statement. His wife passed away, and one of his friends came up and says, do you miss your wife? And what Carl said back to him, James, was he said, yeah, he said, I really do miss my wife, but what I miss more than my wife is what we had together. More than her was what we created when we come together. And I tell couples, I said, if you think you're going to have a baby, or you have a baby, if you're blessed to have one, before you ever create a baby, you're going to create something else. And it's us. There's an usness when two people come together. There's a we. You're suddenly not thinking me, you're thinking we. And when you begin to do that, as James was pointing out, is this sense of, I gotta support this relationship. It's not about who's giving the most and keeping track of, because I tell this in the couples class. If you're keeping track of how much you're doing and how much your wife's doing, you're always going to win. It's kind of like keeping score in golf. You're going to win, right? You're going to keep, because you're keeping the score. You can write it down. We always see the things we do. We don't always see the things. I don't see half the things that Linda does for me, but I see everything I do, and I'm kind of counting it. And so when I'm keeping score, I'm always thinking, I've been gypped. I've been doing so much more than she has, and she's not doing enough, because I see everything I do. I don't see a lot of things she's doing for me. And so scorekeeping is a dead end. You can read John Gottman on this, and if you're tracking to say we're going to keep it 50-50, and we're going to really share the load here, and you start keeping an eye on how much you're doing, you're going to get into this kind of gotcha. I'm doing more. How come you're not doing your share? And there's times that that one of you is going to do so much more than the other. Somebody's sick, somebody's injured, somebody has a mental health crisis or something, and so it's not going to be equal, and it doesn't have to be a good relationship.
I mean, I think it's what the Bible's groping for when it says, and the two became one flesh. I don't think it means they merged into each other, but they created, there's an us. And that's part of that missional thing. Wangren, I love his book. One of the things he says is that couples spend, they can get fixated on looking at each other. And he said the real magic, though, comes is when you turn together as that us and you look out to the world. Let's go out to the world and go do something. Let's go. It's interesting, isn't it? Because otherwise you're looking just for everything from each other. But no, let's go together out into the world. Interesting image. What else?
What's the name of that Weingartner book you're saying?
The Wangren book, it's called As for Me and My House. It's funny also. He just narrates hilarious things that happen in his marriage. So it's a cool book. What else? Children. Let's talk about children. I thought about this. I'm one of those. This is actually interesting. I'm one of those. Somehow I heard early on that my parents were struggling in their marriage and they had me to save their marriage. Don't tell your children this. It's like a lot of pressure. And then when you fail, you fail. Anyway, the role of children in a marriage, if you look at the Bible is actually pretty interesting. The Bible doesn't hold children in the glowing awe that we hold children in. Isn't that interesting? You know what I'm saying? Children today are these little gods and goddesses, and they're so amazing, and every little thing they do is charted and championed, and the Bible doesn't really do that. I don't know what that means, but the way children, or the lack thereof, change a marriage is intense, and it's not well conceived, and often introduces a whole nother set of struggles and issues. So some of that, I think, is kind of that idolization of the family. If the child becomes your functional God, there'll be problems. If the family becomes your functional God, that breaks down their problems. Talk about kind of how children factor into this.
Yeah, in counseling you might call sometimes we see couples where counselors will say, it's a child-centered relationship, or it's a child-centered family, and it's not a healthy term, because what you're really saying is the foundation of a couple is supposed to be the relationship between the two of them. And when you introduce that third party, or have a child or a couple children, and that becomes the whole focus, then that is not meant to bear the weight of that family. The children are to be kind of, up here is the couple, and then structurally the children kind of underneath that. And if the children are kind of up here on the same level, and it's everything they're doing, and we're going to every event, and we got to be there all the time, and it's all about them, that they're not made for that. That puts too much, as you said, pressure on them. It's a child-centered family. The center of the family is the relationship between the couple. If the couple are okay and their marriage is okay, the kids are going to be fine. But if you're putting all your energy into the kids, and the marriage is falling apart and the relationship is suffering, the kids aren't going to be fine no matter how many activities you get them involved with. And so it's the relationship that really matters. And I had one more thought. I don't know if I heard it this week. I was thinking I heard it this week. But I heard a phrase, somebody said something along this line, and it said, some people are more married than others. Some people are more married than others. And I don't remember where I heard that. I've been thinking about, what does that really mean? But I don't know exactly what the person that said it, because I can't remember where I heard it. But here's what that means to me when I think about Christian marriage. James pointed to the license that we have to sign as ministers. I'm not sure why it was a South Carolina one. I'm in North Carolina. But anyway, he pointed to the license. It was South Carolina license. But anyway, this is what we sign, and you're married. But some people are more married than others. And what I mean by that is, you can all get a legal document and go to the justice of the peace, you can get married, but the people who are more married than others are the people who are thinking about, okay, what does it mean to be married? You know, what was that commitment I really took? And it was a commitment to move beyond romance, which is like, you're just like me. I think I've married my soulmate and I'm starry-eyed. And to realize that that's okay for now, but when that dies, something now can really grow up, which is mature and richer and deeper, and you can really be married in a deeper way, which is, I'm now there for another person in the same way, in a faithful way, that the way God is there for me. I'm embodying that presence and that love and that compassion for another person to the best of my ability in the flesh, the same way Christ does that for God, for us. And they're more married than other people, right? Right? Some people are more married than others, and so, you know, it's one thing to get legally married, but if you want a Christian marriage, there's some quality about the relationship that has the impact of changing us. I've been deeply changed by being married. I had this great quote from a friend of mine who did CP training at Parkview Hospital in Fort Wayne back in the day, and he said something along the lines. He said, you know, Bill, he said, thank God I got married, because if I hadn't got married, I'd just be a crazy old man living by myself. And really what he was saying is, you know, marriage is this last great chance to grow up, and you get married to somebody, and they see all your faults and flaws, and they're going to tell you all about them, and they give you a chance to work on them if you'll do the U-turn and kind of take it in and kind of figure it out. But a lot of times we resist that kind of information. So marriage is this wonderful institution, I think, from God that gives us a chance to continue to grow spiritually, emotionally, with the challenges of learning to grow up and figure out kind of all the places I want to project all my stuff onto somebody else, and I have to do the U-turn and come back and go inward and kind of figure out what's going on inside of me and redeem that and heal it and nurture it, and then offer that same kind of healing to other people, to the world. As James said, turn that relationship out to the world.
Lenny.
Talk for a minute about having a sense of humor. Having a sense of humor. I think it's a very important element in marriage.
Sense of humor. Yeah, well, it's dicey. I've got a friend, he's got a wicked sense of humor. Self-effacing, being able to laugh off something is a tremendous gift. And it's not just people with a sense of humor. That's a disposition, right? Is that you're deciding everything is not life and death. The door being locked, as it turns out, isn't, you know. So can you laugh about it instead of doing this?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of sense of humor. I like to make jokes. I have to be careful. Mine can go over the line if I'm not careful, but I love to make jokes. But I also realize jokes can also be a way of, if I'm not careful, everything can become a joke, you know, and an intimate moment can become a joke, and it ruins the moment of being there present and being fully vulnerable. So humor can be a great gift. It can also have a way of keeping some distance. You know, you look at all the great comics, they're always laughing, but a lot of them behind that laugh, there was a lot of pain that they weren't dealing with and needed to deal with. So, but I love a sense of humor. I love a good joke. Yeah. Yeah, if you can't laugh at yourself and laugh a little bit at life, it's a long, long haul, right? Anybody else?
I'm going to repeat a joke Bill said. Since we're in this marriage conversation setting, I think it's okay. I wouldn't tell this to other people. When I first came to church, we had the pastor on call thing. It involved pagers, and the pagers weren't working especially well. So we decided to transfer to phones, to cell phones. And we were trying to clarify, like, how do you do this? And somebody said, you know, do you take it to bed with you? And Bill said, yeah, put it on vibrate.
I like a good joke.
Sorry. Over the head.
Must be too late.
Too late. Thank you all for coming so much.